Adam, how are you? Adam Zimman of LaunchDarkly and Tom Trahan, CircleCI. How are you?
Happy to be here. Thank you.
Great. So it's the end of the day on Wednesday, May 1. There's still the open source summit. Are you guys going to go to that? The open source summit tomorrow?
Oh, tomorrow, yeah.
Yeah. So how are you participating?
Well, just as an attendee. Tomorrow.
Okay, great.
Be speaking.
So why don't we start with you, Tom, and talk a little bit about what, your first impressions are of this conference, of the people who are coming by. What were they asking about? What were some of the themes that you started hearing, that you heard more of? And then maybe we can move on and talk about the level of experience of the people here and then other discussions beyond that.
Yeah, certainly similar to previous years when DockerCon was really starting to become a top of mind topic for a lot of folks, and the attendance was skyrocketing. Similar topics this year, still around the adoption of containers, the a lot of interest and a lot of talk about the expanding ecosystem around containers in particular, and of course with orchestration as well, right? With the growth of Kubernetes and other tool sets like that. One of the things that we heard quite a bit from folks coming through the expo hall at our booth, for instance, seemed, and it's something that we just hear within our customer base, is similar to, I think, the theme in the first day keynote, that it's becoming a very complicated space with many, many players. I mean, if you look at the CNCF landscape diagram, for instance, now I think that had 30 logos on it a couple of years ago, and now we're up to probably several hundred on that diagram. And people are looking for ways to make sense of all that. They're looking for ways to achieve the end results they desire. So they're looking for simplification. And I think that was kind of a main theme you heard out of that opening day keynote. The concept they talked about their kind of pipelines, where people need to pull together lots of things from across the enterprise. And those are themes we hear all the time. I don't know if you're hearing something similar.
Yeah, I mean, I think that we're definitely hearing a lot around the kind of Docker is now, or containers now, are kind of table stakes in the sense of, yes, I'm going to use them in some capacity. I'm going to do my best to use them as appropriate. But, this is similar to kind of the challenge that I saw back in my days at VMware, where as soon as VMware reached that mainstream adoption of virtual machines, it became more and more about the ecosystem, more and more about the management or the orchestration. And seeing the same trends with Docker and the ecosystem there, people are starting to recognize Docker as a proven technology, as a tool that helps them from a development, from an operations perspective, to have greater predictability, to be able to deploy faster. But they're starting to think about, how do I manage this at scale? How do I enable my developers to be able to build quickly? How do I enable my customers to be able to receive the byproducts of my development team in a reasonable time fashion? Something that I've been having a lot of conversations about is again around this idea that I've been talking a lot about recently, is progressive delivery. And this is the idea.
Oh, you're a red monk. You're a James Governor disciple here.
So James and I actually came up with this term in my backyard.
Oh, you did?
Yes.
Okay, let's hear that story.
So in fairness,
James, you're watching.
Yeah, exactly. So James and I had been talking a lot. We've known each other over the years, and we were talking about. He was seeing a lot of this from a kind of the rapid expansion and adoption of continuous integration and tooling, in tools like Circle. But also, now being at LaunchDarkly, we were talking about in the context of how feature flags, just even a couple of years ago, were something that most people hadn't even really kind of heard of or didn't talk about. And now you ask a room, full of engineers here at DockerCon, and 90+% of them are using them in production. And so it's really kind of changed how people are thinking about it. And one of the driving factors for that was this idea of, I want something more than being able to deploy quickly. The continuous delivery model of being able to merge to master, have it immediately go to production, or just have this kind of binary switch that I can turn on and poof, it's there. people needed more than that. People wanted to be able to progressively expose their audience, their cohorts, to this new functionality to ensure that it was safe, to ensure that their infrastructure could actually support it. I think that for the folks here at DockerCon, this has always been a conversation with people that are operating infrastructure, right? It's fallen into that category. And, people that are on the infrastructure side, the operations teams, they very much want that kind of risk aversion or protection, mentality for their engineers and developers. You see organizations like, AWS or, other places where they've actually said, hey, look, if you build it, you support it, right? You have this kind of on-call engineer mentality. And not every place is going to do that. A lot of enterprise companies have reasons or have, other organizational structures that preclude that or prevent that. But ultimately, they want that functionality. They want the ability to have that kind of protection when they're actually releasing new things.
So progressive delivery then is different than continuous delivery, or is it the same thing?
So the way that I've answered that is, or the way that I like to answer that is that it's an iteration, right? Just like we want to iterate on our software, we need to iterate on our software delivery models. And our software delivery model that has been at the forefront has been continuous delivery. That's where the leading edge teams have been building and how they've been delivering. That's where the kind of teams that are looking to modernize their application stack have been aspiring to. And one of the things that we saw, James and I saw in conversations with each other was that when you started talking about continuous delivery to people who weren't doing it, people who were doing agile, people who were doing waterfall, it was really scary. And there were a couple things that made that really scary. One was that the idea of progressive release, or release progression, your idea of an expanding blast radius, was not adequately articulated in continuous delivery. It was part of the initial conversation, some of the initial books on the topic, but it wasn't highlighted enough, and the tooling wasn't brought forward to the point where it was made clear what should be used. The other aspect of progressive delivery that we've been talking more and more about is the intersection of, kind of Mark Andreessen's statement of software is going to eat the world. Well, we're saying that has already transpired. More and more businesses are reliant on software. Software is used by a greater percentage of individuals in different roles at the company to be able to help run the business. And with that extension of software being a greater impact, we should start thinking as application developers and software developers about how do we actually start doing progressive delegation of the controls of that software. And so that's the key distinction, or the other aspect of progressive delivery that's different from continuous delivery, is that notion of delegation of control.
So Tom, when you're thinking about what your approach is over at CircleCI, I'm thinking about like this complexity that is developing. I think people start to see it. I think when they start to think about continuous delivery, they get really kind of overwhelmed by it. Right?
Yeah.
And, that progressive delivery, way of communicating something makes sense, right? It's iterative. It's not continuous. You just, it is continuous, but it's like an iterative type of thing. But as chaos becomes more kind of like a part of just how they kind of have to think about things, how do you educate your customers to help them bring through that? Because that's just inevitable if you're going to be coming to a conference like this and you're going to start to use the technologies. You're going to find new complexities all the time.
Yeah, so we think of it a little bit differently. I mean, I hadn't heard the term before today, so this has been very educational. Thank you for this. But the same concept is what we talk about. People ultimately, they come to the idea that they want to achieve world-class software delivery. They want to get to high-frequency deployments. They want to be doing this on a continuous basis. But they oftentimes see that there's a lot of complexity that's difficult to get to. Even if people embrace the idea that at some point aspirationally, we'd like to be a continuous delivery firm, even the best places in the world aren't doing that for most of their software, right? They're still progressing things through the process in as automated a fashion as they can, but they still are building in the traditional gates where they can make checks, they can make decisions on when to roll things out in production, and so forth. And so the way we see our customers approach this idea is, number one, they embrace the ideas that, yes, we want to achieve greater and greater levels of the ability to produce software and deliver it to customers more frequently and quicker. And then they have to start to get there incrementally. So I think this lines right up with what you're talking about in terms of progressive delivery. And they typically start with some kind of baseline level of capability. For instance, in their CI/CD processes, they might start with just CI plus unit testing, and then they're going to manage the rest of the pieces manually offline. Then they start to layer on additional layers of maturity. And the ultimate goal is to get to a point where you've got the highest level of confidence possible that when you've submitted new code into the system, into this process, you've been able to validate it and check it with these various increasing layers of maturity that give you the opportunity to know when I put this out into production, I'm going to have confidence in it. And then you can also add things like the feature flag in there that lets you give even more levels of confidence on that process. And so what we end up seeing here is that similar to that earlier comment about the size of the ecosystem, the number of players and products and companies that are trying to help people do this, is that it really does require the ecosystem to work well together. I mean, tools need to interact with each other. They have to be easy to plug together because there's an infinite combination of these tools available to do all these things. And if it's a big bang approach, people have been through ERP implementations. They don't want to do that again, right? They're not looking for a 2-year big bang, let's tear everything down and rebuild it all because that's how we're going to do software delivery. And so they're looking for this incremental approach in the way they deliver software, but also in the way I think that they achieve these capabilities. They want to kind of layer things on, get there incrementally, piece in the tools, let them interact together. And I think that's the kind of things that we certainly see everywhere we go, and it's kind of things I think we were starting to hear Docker talk about today at the conference as well, and yesterday.
One of the things I'm curious about from your guys' point of view are the corner cases that everyone always has, like those old binaries that they're trying to work with. And it was kind of for me, just in covering the PaaS world back several years ago, there was a promise of PaaS, but there was also the unpromise of it.
Yeah.
The unpromise was, no, these corner cases are really difficult, and they're going to still require that configuration. They're going to still require that, that necessity to really treat them differently. But now we're starting to move into kind of the container being served as a way to kind of serve as that mechanism of intermediation to some extent. Is that still the major issue that people have, is about those corner cases, or is it changing, or what?
I mean, I think that the reality with corner cases, and like this was true for virtualization, this is true for containers, this is true for Kubernetes, this is true for any time you're trying to leverage a new technology to support a legacy technology, is that there will be cases where you can kind of cram that square peg into a round hole. But there are going to be other places where you are actually doing yourself a disservice and spending more cycles trying to get that to fit in an awkward shape than you would if you were to simply, kind of create a new cloud native, in this case, application. And so I think that, yes, Docker or containers are capable of supporting more and more diversity in workloads. But I think that there's still limitations there that are, anyone who is looking at it from an architect perspective, and especially when you start thinking about the interactivity between those legacy systems and new services or new applications, I think that you're going to see more and more folks continue to try and either isolate those and continue to run them as they've been run, and either use some type of middleware layer to be able to integrate into the new systems, or they're going to say, okay, now is the time where I'm going to invest and I'm going to create the project that actually migrates that input-output engine into a cloud-native application. Right. And I'm going to do it from the ground up. I'm not going to try this, kind of lift and shift mentality that, ultimately is going to cause more problems than it solves.
Right. So at Google Cloud, they were demonstrating this new, they're demonstrating Google Cloud Run. And I don't know if you were there, but they're showing how an old custom binary like LibreOffice could be wrapped in a function as a service essentially, and then push to Cloud Run. And and then you'll hear others talking about that and that kind of capability. But I'm wondering kind of where the where the real context is,
Yeah.
I mean, is there a promise fulfilled there in terms of how we can think now about, the easier kind of acceleration, the progressive acceleration into?
I would instead of looking at that as promise fulfilled, I would look at that as problem deferred.
Okay.
And that may be my personal opinion.
I like it.
Just in the sense that, like, when you put off being able to actually look at, what is the logic, what is the, kind of calculation, manipulation of data that you're trying to impart, and you say, no, it can only be done this one way. With this, older technology, I think that you're limiting your ability to innovate for the end-to-end problems or challenge or end-to-end solutions for your customers or for your end output.
So Tom, when you think of like container technologies and kind of the context for a DockerCon event, and you think about how organizations are going to be moving, further into these container-based architectures, what are the types of things you're looking for from a developer experience point of view? Because that really becomes more critical than anything, doesn't it?
Yeah, I mean, ultimately, for the most part, what Docker brought to the table and what I think many of the companies here and other companies' ecosystem are focused on is developer productivity. It's like, how do you get the most amount of value created and into customer hands as quickly as possible? And Docker helps to enable it. It's a pretty fantastic enabling piece to that. But there's many pieces to that, right? I mean, folks working on their workstations and leveraging Docker locally to be able to test that things work the way they expect that they're going to work once they're out there in their clusters or in their container services. It's certainly a great step forward. But all those activities that now have to happen, all the networking, the service meshes, the CI/CD delivery flows, all of those pieces all need to come together. And it's really where I think we see a lot of the acceleration coming. It's the normal adoption curve. At the core, the technology itself is rarely ever the single story. It's the enablement of solving problems in a better way that ends up becoming the thing that we all end up, getting real value from. And containers have helped allow for that to be set up and sped up, at a pretty fantastic degree. If you think back, I think when you were at VMware, that the adoption of VMs over time, that took about 15 years for it to be kind of hit full adoption, where you're into the last, the late majority of adopters and so forth. And it was a fairly, typical adoption curve, and that it takes some time. I think we're going to see the same thing here with containers. We've got plenty of folks, of course, engaged, early adopters starting to run, Kubernetes clusters, other types of clusters, Docker Swarm clusters in production. But it's sometimes hard to remember that's still fairly early days in that adoption curve, right? We're probably looking at another 10 years of, accelerating adoption of these technologies. And so it's going to be focused on developer productivity and on the ability to getting that value in as quickly as possible. And every step of the way, it's going to be the ability to continue to increment and get better at that. I think that's going to drive further and further adoption of containers and the use of all the various tools in the ecosystem decently all around it as well.
So how do you view Docker then overall as, kind of compared to like you did a few years ago? Like, what's your viewpoint of Docker now, especially after the event with Docker?
I mean, I think, this is one of the things that I feel like this really transpired last year, more so than this year, was that last year was the first year from my perspective, that DockerCon felt like mainstream industry conference. It was no longer like the leading edge or, kind of the, early adopters. It was mainstream industry, recognized this is a technology that's here to stay. This is something that I'm either working with, have in production, or am actively have a timeline in mind for when this is going to go in production. And this year, I think it's even more so. It's like, it's just, no, this is now an industry conference. This is now something that is, it's not going away. It's something that is an imperative to being able to build, an infrastructure at scale. It has some place in that. And, it's being treated as such, right? So it's starting to, in the idea of an ecosystem, it's starting to become much more relevant, where more and more people are saying, look, I use Docker, and if you're going to be a tool that I'm going to adopt for other, aspects of my infrastructure or my developer productivity, do you function with Docker? And how do you function with Docker? How do you, how can you make, my ease of management or orchestration better?
Yeah, and I think, ultimately, it's hard to have that conversation without distinguishing between little d technology and big D Docker, the company.
Fair.
And I think, without any doubt, the ubiquitous, nature of containers and Docker containers in particular is here, and that's not going away. A real interesting thing, I think that, we started to see a little bit here this year, and will be really interesting to see what happens over the coming year as we head to the next DockerCon, is, how does the big D Docker technologies, how do they keep up? How do they compete with the Kubernetes stories of the world and the managed services and the clouds for running containers and having a relevant story? From what I saw here with Docker Enterprise 3, I think there's a very relevant story there. I think there's a viable customer base there for those products. And one of the things you brought up at the very beginning that I'm certainly interested to see is how much that expands to embrace the ecosystem. I mean, if you look at something like the way Kubernetes has gone, it's ultimately, we mentioned the landscape diagram. It's that embrace of large numbers of ecosystem tools and players and companies that all come together to make it possible, make it successful for the customers. And so, I think we saw some early hints that that's the direction that we're going to see Docker, the company, go here. And I'd love to learn more about that over the coming months and see where that goes. But I think it will be pretty essential to its ultimate, kind of long-term viability, and love to see where that ends up.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. When you think about how you, how Docker adopts newer technologies, if they're just focused more on the runtime more than anything, isn't that really where the emphasis should be for them? I mean, you get sometimes confused listening to kind of what Docker is wanting for Kubernetes, for example. You're not sure whether they want to just kind of go for the ride with it or just really take it, right?
Yeah.
Or are they still kind of hedging with Swarm, right? And so does it matter as much? I mean, if they're really just are the runtime, and do you need to look more toward, do you look to them for open source?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, look, this is, I think, one of the conundrums that Docker is facing, right, is that I think that the aspect of Swarm that you bring up, I think that there are, customers that they have that are using it and happy with it. And so for them, they need to show that they're continuing to, make that a viable option for them. With regards to Kubernetes, I think that there's, few who would, argue that Kubernetes kind of beat out Swarm in that context, and being able to do some of the orchestration stuff that Docker had envisioned but didn't, execute on to the same degree or get adoption at the same rate. I think that from an ecosystem perspective, I think Docker as a company is doing the right thing by trying to embrace the technologies that their customers are wanting to use. I think that it is from the balance between open source and a solution that they're providing to the enterprise. There's that balance that they need to strike of what are the value add services that people are willing to pay for and are looking to come to them for to help enable them. And I think that realistically, the kind of standard playbook from an industry or infrastructure perspective has always been, how can I start adding more value from a management, from an orchestration perspective? And so they're looking at ways in which they can participate in that conversation. Yeah. The interesting part to me is that more and more open source alternatives are coming up in that space, which previously was not the case. Right? It used to be that the open source community was really concerned with the individual service or the runtime type environments, right? And then the higher order value components or programs or applications were things that they were individual developers that were contributing, and they didn't spend time on. That was why the kind of enterprise software companies were able to come in and do that as a value add and sell it. Now you've got, how many different service meshes are there? How many different orchestration layers are there for either containers or
Right.
functions or other aspects of the business that realistically are that kind of higher order business function that previously were kind of avoided by the open source community.
So, so just in conclusion, we're coming into uh, kind of a different time as well, where security is a much more heightened. It is far more heightened than concerns about security are far more heightened than ever before, with with good reason.
Yeah.
And we did have the the Docker hack. We don't know a lot about it, but how do you think about that in kind of context of overall software supply chain security? Does this seem like an insignificant issue to you, or is it more a existential fear than anything else?
Well, I mean, I think regardless of the answer to that question, if you attended the RSA conference a month ago, it was as big as reInvent, if I'm not mistaken. I mean, there were 970 vendors there in the expo hall. So it is a big deal. Everybody is focused on it. Everyone is concerned about it. And it's certainly something that, every enterprise on the planet, every company is worried about. And it's really just part of that maturity process, right? I mean, if you're going to be developing software at speed and getting it into customers' hands as quickly as possible, you have to be doing it in a secure and reliable manner. I mean, the whole world of DevOps is based around this idea that on the one side, you've got innovation and R&D and create new things. On the other hand, on the ops side, it's all around reducing risk and not letting things break, right? Don't let customers' worlds break down. And coming together is ultimately what DevOps does. And it's really when you put this whole end-to-end flow together, and what Docker is as a technology, is a key part of helping to enable that speed and that portability. You can't really do that if you don't include that piece in. I mean, security, is one of the key connection points that lets those two worlds of dev and ops come together. As long as you get a good story in there, you've got good products and vendors that provide the ability to kind of ensure that security exists before you push things out into production. I think you're going to see folks, embrace it and continue to move at the speed that they're moving. I don't think it's going to get bogged down because security is a priority. Because if you look at the vendors that are here and the ones in the ecosystem, they understand just as well as anyone else that having security doesn't mean we're going to forego speed, right? We ultimately want to be fast.
I think interestingly, I was listening to a podcast by Corey Quinn where you had Jess Roselli on, I guess, a week or two ago. And this question of security and Docker containers came up. And she pointed out that she built a secure Docker container that is hosted online and, basically has challenged anyone to be able to break out of it or break into it. And no one has. And I truly believe that containers can be secure. The trade-off that a lot of people make is security and convenience. And I think that has, oftentimes been the case. I think that, yes, I would love to see more services have a greater impetus to take security over convenience to a greater degree. But I think that there has to be a consumer push for that layer of security. I think we're starting to see it, but I would still argue that you look at the kind of outcomes from security breaches, major security breaches that have transpired just over the past year, and you don't see a whole lot of fewer people using Facebook.
No.
And other services like that.
Yeah,
where,
that's not the point though either.
well, I mean, I think that it's a function of like what do people expect, right? I mean, I think that yes, obviously the financial services industry is going to continue to take security very seriously, and that's going to be why they take more time with regards to their implementations on technology, and they forego convenience to some degree to be able to do that.
So what is a LaunchDarkly trust posture then? Like how do you establish your own as trust, and what do you learn from something like this?
Yeah, I think that what my takeaway, and our takeaway as a company is that we want to enable people to be, more secure and be able to be risk averse, but still be able to move quickly. to Tom's point, right? This is the desire of everyone, right? You want to have your, increase your delivery and reduce your time to market, but you also want to reduce your risk. And those two are very difficult to balance. And so what we talk about and what we see our customers doing is using feature flags as a mechanism for being able to move faster, but with less risk.
Because the
Right.
flags help define.
You can, we talk about, Tom talked earlier about the ability to, think about your pipeline and think about how you're being able to take your manual interactions or being able to move from like a staging to production to be able to have better gates in place for that process. What we talk about with our customers and we see our customers doing is that they're using the feature flag itself to be able to create that gate so that they can do more of the testing in production that people are realizing is an imperative to being able to move fast, right? You don't want to be gated on being able to actually do real world workloads. You want to make sure that you're protecting your customers while you're, being able to evaluate whether or not your new code is ready for production.
Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, to your question about how do you ensure the posture?
Yeah, I'm thinking about your own posture. Yeah.
I mean, for us, it's one of the most important things internally. And I think it ultimately, you mentioned that consumers have to drive the behavior. I actually think the opposite is probably more important. The companies have to drive their own behavior. They have to insist on in embracing secure policies. I mean, CircleCI, we're FedRAMP authorized. We've passed, federal government audit of our security. That's how important it is to us internally, is that we make it something that is one of the top priorities of our engineering platform and everything that we do. And I think, it comes back to what you said about convenience plus, people trade off convenience for security. And ultimately it comes down to how convenient can you make it to be secure? How well do the ecosystem players that focus on security make it easy to get that included in the creation of your code, the validation of your code? There's so many great products and tools coming out. You got signature authorities, signing authorities on container images. You've got scanning, obviously, that takes place. You've got runtime analysis that happens. As I mentioned, there's no shortage of vendors focused on this space. And the more that these become easier to integrate in with the broader process flow and the ultimate business problem it's trying to solve, I think you're going to see that trade-off question becomes less important because it's not hard to add security to your piece. It's going to obviously take some time to get there, but I think we're certainly headed in that direction.
Right. Well, any last thoughts, Adam?
Yeah, I think that totally agree with everything that Tom said. I think that the only thing that I would say is that, look, we take security very seriously at LaunchDarkly as well. And I would love to live in a world where, that is the norm for people that are building software and services. And I think that the reality, though, is that is just something that, because the tooling is not convenient, people will cut corners. And so one of the things that we're trying to do in the product that we're delivering is enabling people not to cut corners, enabling people to be security conscious and security minded as a inherent way of building software.
Well, this has been a great conversation.
Yeah, thanks for having
Adam.
us.
Thanks, Tom. Really appreciate your time and
Definitely.
the best of luck in this season, and we look forward to keeping in touch.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alex.